When we consider the prospects of a deal being made here, Iran is suggesting that one will not be until we see a resolution to Israel's incursion into Lebanon in the name of going after Hezbollah. How do you see that resolving, given the public rhetoric we continue to get from Bibi Netanyahu?
Well, thanks for having me back. I mean, I think what we're seeing is that despite the desire by the administration, it's becoming increasingly difficult to keep Lebanon separate from these broader Iran talks, and that Tehran has not relented in demanding that a ceasefire be across the board. And so I think the president is struggling with how to manage for that demand and not risk losing the possibility of an agreement, at least in the near term, on the Strait of Hormuz and on future negotiations on the nuclear program because of Israel's escalation in Lebanon.
Secretary Marco Rubio, we were noting, made the point in congressional testimony earlier today that sometimes it takes days to hear back from Iran because of their communications challenges. The president here is suggesting that they are talking every day. Is it possible that they're talking to different people?
I think both things can be true at the same time. I think that there is constant communication, especially through the mediators. We've seen that Pakistan, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and others have been part of this process since the first day, and they've been continuing to try and keep those indirect channels open. So you add that step, that definitely prolongs the time that messages take to go back and forth. And then you consider that the leadership inside of Iran knows that the United States and Israel is very eager to find out exactly where the supreme leader and other members of the leadership are at any given moment. And so the degree of caution, I think, that they're taking to stay under the radar compounds this timeline. So I think there is probably talk with mediators every day, every hour even, but the back and forth directly with the Iranian players is taking some time.
Well, and as we consider the players, and to Joe's suggestion that they may be talking to different people, how do we guarantee that all different parties in Iran would abide by a deal if one could be reached? We note the resignation of the Iranian president over the weekend, suggesting that too much power has been given over to the IRGC. Is that who's really in charge here, who needs dealing with?
I mean, I think we've definitely seen since the beginning of the war and the targeting of so much of the previous regime's leadership that there has been a consolidation of power. And while I wouldn't say that it's the IRGC solely in the position of power, it has certainly gotten the upper hand on the decision-making inside of Iran. I mean, ultimately, we're seeing indications that the supreme leader, the new supreme leader, Khamenei, is in fact surrounding himself with his closest advisors and is making decisions, perhaps slowly. But that consolidation of power is most certainly in the security apparatus, including the IRGC.
Elisa, what's the point of seeking a 60-day extension to the ceasefire if we seem to be in one already indefinitely?
Well, we have been, right? I think part of the challenge is that it's a fragile one. It's been a fragile ceasefire since April. The Strait of Hormuz has not been reopened fully to commercial traffic. And so while the guns perhaps have gone mostly silent, although not entirely silent, the situation is not what you would want it to be. And so this conversation about a negotiation is really an agreement to continue to talk. It's really not dealing with the issues of the nuclear program, but it does give perhaps an opening to get the Strait of Hormuz more open than it has been, certainly with less direct threats from Iran on commercial traffic and on neighboring countries' infrastructure. We have seen that continue even during the ceasefire. We've had quite a number of attacks in Kuwait and UAE on commercial vessels, even as recently as reports today. But it has died down. What this deal would get you is the opening of the Strait of Hormuz in some form that allows the 1,000+ vessels that are still stuck there and have been stuck there since February to move out, and for some of that commerce to resume. And everything else gets kicked down the road for at least 60 days.
Well, and when we consider the prospect surround the Strait of Hormuz. Elisa, in a phone interview yesterday, President Trump suggested that just because there's no deal doesn't mean he's going to return to firing on them. He just says, okay, we'll just maintain the U.S. blockade. For how long is that a sustainable position for the United States?
Well, I think technically the United States could continue the blockade for some time in terms of the vessels that are deployed and the assets that are necessary to conduct that mission. That is sustainable, but it's at a cost. It's at a cost for supporting that operation, at a cost of what we're not doing, what the U.S. military is not doing elsewhere in the world as it continues to be focused on the United States. But I think what we're seeing here is that both sides see very little upside to returning to that kind of hot conflict. But the president isn't getting what he wants. He's not getting the capitulation he has sought from Iran, despite his coercive diplomacy, despite his aggressive statements, despite the economic pressure. And so he's continuing that pursuit, but it's not getting him the surrender that he's looking for.
Interesting. You know, there's a line in Washington that we hear a lot on Capitol Hill: time kills deals. As more weeks drag by, could we resolve into some sort of rolling ceasefire that lasts the rest of the year, that goes on for years, possibly?
Well, I think in some ways that might be the least of the bad options, right? If you do have some degree of confidence that the strait will reopen, that the hot conflict will not return, and that some degree of negotiations on the nuclear front are being pursued, that might be enough to kind of bridge the gap. I think the real question here, and I think this is what concerns partners and allies in the region and beyond, is the kind of unpredictability of the U.S.'s staying power in such a kind of prolonged and fragile situation, and whether the president will continue to kind of stay the course, even if that's not the best option. It may be the least bad of the bad options.
Well, Elisa, finally, if we can come back to Israel, as Benjamin Netanyahu considers his options, does he have the incentive right now to just go along with whatever it is President Trump wants, or do domestic considerations at home give him a whole different set of incentives and therefore options he may want to consider?
Well, the domestic situation is always at the front of mind of the Prime Minister of Israel. I think that is just even more in sharp relief when you have elections on the horizon, and those elections are planned for later this fall, September, possibly October. And so every decision he makes, I think, has to be seen, at least in part, through that domestic lens. And what we're seeing, I think, in Lebanon in terms of the escalation in recent days and everything on the ground kind of indicates that we are definitely seeing an escalation. This is more significant than anything we've seen in the last 20 years. It reflects maybe an anticipation of what we might see President Trump do in terms of exercising some leverage and restraint on Prime Minister Netanyahu. We obviously saw reports of that alleged call and then the reaction to that report of the alleged call. But I do think that this escalation reflects, anticipating a moment at which that space is going to be close and not able to pursue targeting Hezbollah in quite the same way. But I think I would end with saying that at the end of the day, we've seen that military force alone isn't working in Lebanon. It's not completely eliminating the Hezbollah threat, and that disarming Hezbollah is not something that happens overnight. But we are, I think, seeing talks resume today between Israel and Lebanon here in Washington. And it's this very thing that's going to give you a sustainable solution.